for the general public as a resource, I cover ants to yellow jackets, but the big focus of my job is research and outreach on the prevention of tick-borne diseases like Lyme, but the headline is it's not just about Lyme anymore. We have a number of different pathogens these ticks can transmit.
Okay, so we're going to get into some of the more controversial stuff immediately.
Okay.
And that is, for those that follow Lyme disease, they know that the surveillance criteria has changed over the years as to be compared to the clinical ways of diagnosing Lyme disease. So was it about 2 years ago that the CDC actually changed the reported cases? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. The CDC had been reporting year on year 30,000 cases of Lyme disease in the United States. And they got a lot of pushback from patient advocacy groups that how can that be 30,000? You know, I've had Lyme, my family's had Lyme, my friends have had Lyme. How can it be 30,000? And so, as you pointed out, the CDC fessed up 2 years ago and changed that number from 30,000 to 300,000, so a tenfold increase. So they didn't admit why they did that, but the reporting of Lyme disease is it's a big problem. It's a reportable disease, but it's woefully underestimated.
Well, I think earlier you mentioned to me off camera that Lyme disease has been found in more than 80 countries. So
Sure.
How is that defined, and where do those numbers come from?
There's a number of countries around the world that are endemic for Lyme disease. Europe, parts of Asia, Australia, but it's highly controversial in Australia. The Ministry of Health it basically says Lyme does not exist in Australia, so they're getting a lot of pushback from sick people. So we don't know what's going on. But my point in talking about things like that is that this didn't start out in Lyme, Connecticut 40 years ago and radiate outward. It's not a new disease. It's a re-emerging disease. It's circumpolar in distribution. So it's been everywhere for tens of thousands of years.
So let's dig a little bit deeper. How are the cases reported, and of the cases that are counted, how many are we missing? For example, I just recently tested positive for Babesia, and I have no way of knowing if that was reported to anyone or not. Now, granted, that's a co-infection, so that's a two-part question. How are all these things getting reported here in the States?
Well, it's reportable, but based on conversations with DPH, a doctor might look at a patient that may have a bullseye rash and say, all right, you have Lyme disease, that's a clinical positive, give them their script and not follow up on the paperwork, which I guess is kind of onerous. So there's a number of doctors that just treat people and don't follow up. So DPH recognizes that. So the overall rankings by county are probably accurate. The absolute numbers probably are way underreported. So they're taking a whole different approach to this because they recognize it's a flawed process and probably not going to be fixed. So the angle they're looking at now is to look at insurance claims and use that as a proxy for cases of Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses. So I haven't seen their numbers yet. They're mushing that around, but it's not ready for prime time. But I've got a good contact at DPH, and once it's available, I will have it.
Let's get into some of the bug stuff that is your forte.
Sure.
So there's a lot of different ticks out there, and there's still a little bit of controversy about which ticks carry what. So at least as far as New England, what are all the different tick species that can carry disease-causing pathogens?
There's a number of them out there. A number of them might be burrow dwellers and nest dwellers, and you wouldn't necessarily bump into them. But there are 3 on the Cape that are big players. So we of course have dog ticks, and I consider them more of an annoyance than a public health threat, even though they can vector Rocky Mountain spotted fever and tularemia, but those are rare in Massachusetts. We have a new tick on the Cape, Lone Star tick, and this thing has been moving north for a number of years. We think it's associated with climate change. So we have that well established on the Cape, and it's probably going to spread across the rest of Massachusetts at some point in time. And then the front and center player is the deer tick. And with deer tick, it's very prevalent, and it has 5 different pathogens that we know of that it can vector to humans. And you can also be co-infected. In fact, with our surveillance research this year, we found that on Cape Cod, 13% of the ticks were co-infected.
That shouldn't surprise anyone, though, because some of the tick drags that have been done throughout New England, I'm thinking about Eva Shoppe's work with her students going back 4 or 5 years ago. I think the majority of the ticks that they found, at least in the area in Connecticut that they did this, had co-infections, mycoplasmas, protozoa, viruses. So have there been any changes in the technology, the diagnostics that are employed to look for these co-infections in the last 5 or 6 years?
For the tick analysis, I work with the Laboratory of Medical Zoology at UMass Amherst, Steve Rich's group. They use polymerase chain reaction, PCR. Unlike the human blood test for something like Lyme, PCR is 99.99% accurate. So if it says it is, it is. And so we just with our Cape Cod ticks, we have probably 5,000 tick analyses that we have evaluated over time. So we've got a very good handle on distribution of rates of infection and rates of co-infection. But when I presented that probably 4 years ago to our medical community on the Cape, we host physicians forums every year. And when I presented those data, they just about fell out of their chairs. They had no idea what the exposure risk for people really was.
Say that another way. They were surprised with the newer data, or what was so surprising to them?
That the levels of infections in the ticks, particularly for these emerging diseases, I mean, when I showed them that at certain places on the Cape, the infection rate for like Babesia or Anaplasma was on par with Borrelia, and that was shocking to them. So it gave them kind of like, we got to look at our patients in probably a different light, particularly with this co-infection.
So can we assume that that has been the case all along, or is this a new phenomenon that we've just woken up to?
These emerging diseases seem like they're following the pattern of Lyme disease, say 30 years ago. Started out on the Cape and the islands and kind of spread across the Commonwealth. And when we see the distribution of cases of babesiosis, for example, over 50% of the cases in the state occur on the Cape and the islands. So it's following that same pattern of distribution.
Interesting. What role are some of the, well, let's talk about vectors, things like birds.
Mm-hmm.
So birds certainly carry these ticks, far and near, right? Are they themselves a part of the process of transmitting disease?
Yes. So the birds play 2 roles. One is they're great dispersal agents. That's how we think Lone Star was introduced to Cape Cod, barrier beaches, perfect flyways for migratory birds. But there's a number of birds that are competent host reservoirs, meaning they can carry the Lyme disease bacteria and toss that back into the tick population. So it's kind of like microbial ping pong. Research at Yale found that 50% of the songbirds they tested were positive for Borrelia burgdorferi, including our American robin, and our good old friend the wild turkey, which is well established on the Cape. So birds play a role, but if you look at the overall ecosystem, it's complex. This deer tick is associated with 125 different vertebrate hosts. So the competent hosts like the mice and some of the birds and voles and shrews, and then we have a number of incompetent hosts like the deer and the raccoons and the coyotes. They can't infect the ticks, but they can certainly supply blood meal. So it's a complex ecosystem, a lot of moving parts, which makes it pretty fascinating for me.
Yeah, this is backing up a little bit, but
Sure.
Just for the people out there that might be new to some of the stuff really discovered in the last 3 or 4 years, there's a lot of Borrelia species and some newly identified ones, and there's a lot of strains. And these things matter because some strains might not be detectable from previous older technologies and diagnostics. And some of the newer species, like Miyamotoi, might not be detectable again with these older diagnostics. So can you sort of taxonomize that whole universe out there of what's going on with Borrelia and other species?
I'm not a microbiologist or an immunologist by any stretch. Sure, there's lots of different strains of Borrelia burgdorferi. It's interesting that There are more strains in Europe than in North America, which is why pharmaceuticals have done their clinical vaccine trials in Europe, just to make sure that it's covering, across the board. So it's a complex organism. It morphs into different shapes, and in some cases it doesn't have a cell wall. So if you're working with an antibiotic that is focused on cell walls, it's not going to touch it. So it's a complex, insidious organism.
Okay, so let's get into some of the more practical matters. You're in your yard and you're walking around and you find something on you. Let's just talk about what's going on in terms of how we can protect ourselves.
Sure. If you think about tick habitat, deer ticks, because Lone Star kind of pushes the envelope, deer ticks you find in shady, high humid environments like leaf litter and trees, but also in woody ornamental plantings. That's tick habitat too. So you got to look at your yard as your exposure risk is not just the woods. It can be a lot of different places. Surveillance research in Connecticut found that over 2/3 of the people that submitted ticks for identification and testing picked up that tick in doing yard activities. So ticks and gardening go hand in hand. So basically those are the areas you just have to be mindful of. We look at our program as a 3-phase plan, okay? The 3 Ps: protect yourself, protect your yard, and protect your pets. You got to do all 3. So for personal protection, things like if you do have a tick attached to you, proper removal. So it's not the Vaseline or the match or some of the other old wives' tales things. It's pointy tweezers. So you just grab that thing by the head, gently pry up, and then what do you do with the tick? And a lot of people throw it away, but that's evidence. And so I'm a big advocate of testing the tick, sending it to UMass Amherst for a fee, and finding out what you were potentially exposed to. So now you have hard data that, I was bitten by a tick, I'm not feeling so good, and now I've got this tick report that shows I potentially was exposed to, Lyme or Babesia or Powassan Virus, and so it gives the doctors kind of a better handle on what they should be looking for in their patients. So of course the standard boilerplate recommendation is the long pants tucked into your socks, and people on the Cape make bold-fashioned statements, but that's when they're not making. For me, the number one tool in the box that I discovered 6 years ago was Pyrethrum-treated clothing and footwear. Hands down, the most effective thing you can do. What I found in my research on this product is that if a tick gets exposed to a treated surface for 60 seconds, on average that tick is off to meet its maker in about 9 minutes. And so I wear this year round, and it'll keep its activity through 6 washings on clothing. I treat footwear about every 4 weeks, and the footwear is mission critical. And here's why. The nymph stage ticks are down in the leaf litter. The first place they attach to are your shoes, and they're out during the summer months. They're very tiny, size of a poppy seed, and that stage is responsible for 85% of all tick-borne illnesses. So I regard the treating the footwear as important. So my metric is the message getting out there. The biggest problem with Pyrethrum was finding it on the Cape. It was only Eastern Mountain Sports. And I convinced all the major garden centers on the Cape to carry product. And so I do store checks. I'll meet with store managers every year. Yeah, we got the right products on the shelf. Are you selling anything? And in the past couple of years, they're more out of stock than in stock. Mm-hmm. So the word is definitely out there, and then we see it in the case data. We're level playing field for incidence rate of Lyme.
I actually got some 6 months ago online. It was readily available, so
Sure.
I'm glad that it is. Now, if I recall, this is a chemical that is very safe for humans. And is this the one that's synthesized from chrysanthemum or a flower like that?
Well, natural pyrethrum is an extract from a type of chrysanthemum grown in Africa. And it's a very safe product, and it's quick knockdown on things that touches low mammalian toxicity. But the problem is breaks down in a couple hours on exposure to sunlight. So what chemists did was they looked at the backbone or the chemical architecture of natural pyrethrum, figured out where it was being broken apart, and figured out a way to stabilize those points so you get something that lasts longer. So that's where they came up with permethrin and cymethrin and a whole bunch of other thrins.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how these little critters work so effectively. So they tend to go to tall grass or branches and sort of hang off, and I believe that's called questing.
That's
So-
a behavior.
so-
Well, for deer ticks, Lone Star
Ah.
ticks are a completely different animal that we're starting to understand. Unlike deer ticks, Lone Star ticks have great vision and they can run. If they see you, they will chase you. And I've seen that. Whereas deer ticks are blind and they're passive ambush predators. So they have this questing behavior where they extend their front legs up in the air and just wait for something to brush by, and then they attach. So the adult stage ticks, yeah, they might be on vegetation a couple feet off the ground. They're looking for a larger host. The nymph stage and the larval stage ticks, they're down in the leaf litter. They're waiting for something like a mouse, a shrew, or some small ground nesting birds.
Now you've done a lot of work almost on what I would call demographics, where you've determined what ages of people are generally affected. Can you speak to that data?
Sure. Those are data from Department of Public Health and CDC. And if you look at the distribution by age group for, let's say, Lyme disease to start with, kids age 5 to 9 have the highest incidence rate of Lyme disease in the state. And then the incidence rate goes down for people in their 20s and 30s and 40s because people are starting careers, they're starting families, they're not as much engaged in outdoor activities. And as you get older and you get more free time for outdoor recreation, so in your 50s and 60s, that's where you see this other spike of cases. And we didn't know exactly how that was happening, but based on the data we get from UMass, those are the two groups getting most of the tick bites. But then if you push this demographic thing a little further, let's look for babesiosis, for example, that you've personally dealt with. 95% of the cases are in people 60 years and older. So it rarely affects younger people. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, it's not frequent. Same thing with anaplasmosis. So there's something, probably the fact that when you're in your 50s and 60s, your immune system is playing the back nine, so to speak.
There were a lot of questions about sort of big picture questions, like what the heck is going on? Are things getting worse in terms of diseases? And maybe that's an opportunity to talk about, is it Powassan? Is that how you say it?
Powassan.
Powassan. Yeah, what the heck is this?
Powassan was a disease discovered in 1959 in Powassan, Ontario. And so most of the cases were in the upper central Midwest, but it's rare, but it's also had been showing up on the East Coast. And to our knowledge, until a couple of years ago, we didn't think it was on Cape Cod. And lo and behold, I learned from Mass Department of Public Health that in the past 3 years, we've had 14 cases of Powassan virus in the state. 3 of those cases, actually 4, were fatal, and 2 of those fatalities were on Cape Cod. So what I did with Steve Rich is we set up surveillance research last year. We collected ticks from all over the Cape, 6 different sampling sites. And we wanted to find out, okay, can we find Powassan in the tick population? And we were stunned at our data. We found Powassan-infected ticks at 4 out of the 6 sites, ranging from Falmouth all the way out to Truro, at infection rates as high as 10%. And that's when we had to really look at this and say, this looks a lot like West Nile virus. A lot of people can probably be exposed to this thing and be completely asymptomatic, but in the rare instances where it goes neuroinvasive, that's when things get very dicey. So you get encephalitis or meningitis, and it's fatal in about 10% of the cases.
So there might be 2 variables here. Are there different strains of the virus? And why would some people be more susceptible than others? Is it because they have a weakened immune system, or is it possibly a more virulent strain of the virus?
That I don't know. It could be either. So we're not completely sure how that operates. We know, for example, even with babesiosis, there was a study in eastern New York where they took blood samples from people, and I think 10% of the population they tested were tossing out antibodies to Babesia, so they were exposed and asymptomatic.
Interesting. So, forgive me if this is redundant, but where did this virus come from? Does anyone know, and how it's being spread?
It's probably been here for tens of thousands of years. It's just flown under the medical radar screen.
Interesting. And are there researchers anywhere taking a closer look at this to see if it's a public threat or how serious it is? Because there have been fatalities, is that correct?
There have been, and what's been frustrating on our part is that we shared our data with Department of Public Health, and we recommended statewide surveillance. Let's see what this thing looks like across the Commonwealth. And DPH stops at the point of gathering surveillance data, and they don't extend it into doing surveillance of like tick populations and things like that. So they appreciate what we find, but they're not about to invest money to take it to the next level.
Got it. All right, so a few questions from friends and relatives. Shirley asks, are there any natural enemies of these ticks?
Sure. Birds will pick them off vegetation, primarily the adult stage ticks. Reptiles will feed on these things, and interestingly, there's a fungus that attacks these ticks in Metarhizium anisopliae, and so the tick bumps into the fungal spore and it attaches to the cuticle. Then it germinates and penetrates inside the tick, and basically just takes over all the inside of it. And then it sends out more spores, so it's kind of like invasion of the body snatchers.
Is this a natural spore? Or
Yeah.
Are people working on perhaps making that into an insecticide? Or?
Yes, it is available. Met52 is the trade name. And so there's some expanded trials in Connecticut and New York to more fully evaluate how well that works versus a conventional pesticide like permethrin or bifenthrin. So yeah, it's available.
Now, a lot of people out there, myself included, have pets.
Sure.
Do you have a pet at home?
Oh yeah.
All right. So how do you protect your cat or your dog from these darn things?
Well, there's a great product that came on the market a couple of years ago. What's been available for a number of years is these topicals, the Canine Advantix 2 for dogs. You have to pay attention to the products, that things for dogs aren't necessarily good for cats. So Canine Advantix 2 contains permethrin, which is okay with dogs, but cats are very sensitive to permethrin, and you can hurt a cat badly. So you got to pay attention to product selection. And for the monthly topicals, some people, it gets old after a while. Did I do it last month? Do I feel like doing it this month? And so Bayer Ag came up with a product, a collar called Seresto with an S. You put that on your animal, you get 8 months of continuous flea and tick control. And I've talked with a lot of dog owners that have swapped out of Canine Advantix 2 to this collar, and they're very, very happy.
Good.
And if you look at the cost, the upfront cost of the collar might be $60 or so, but if you do the arithmetic in the long run, it's far cheaper than the monthly topical.
And we hope and assume that there were rigorous tests on the safety of these collars.
Sure, it has to go through the EPA registration process that includes a full toxicology workup.
Okay, Larry, there's been a lot of questions about other insects, vectors that might cause the transmission of these bugs, for example, mosquitoes. Now, there's been many, many studies, especially in Europe, going back 10, 15 years, that have identified various Borrelia species and even co-infections in mosquitoes. So it seems like the jury is still out if, in fact, transmission can occur, but people are just scratching their heads and saying, wait a minute here, how can they not be transmitted to another host? Can you speak to that?
It seems intuitive that if you've got the bug and are a biter, you could have transmission potential. It's not the way the game works. There's a principle called vector competency. So for a tick, this bacteria has adapted to be able to live inside the chemical environment of a tick gut, as well as the chemical environment of a warm-blooded host. So this bacteria kind of changes its surface proteins in response to its environment. If you look at the chemical environment of a mosquito gut, it's not the same as a tick gut. So that bacteria might be there, but it doesn't automatically make that organism a vector, okay? There was some interesting research that bears this out that was done at Rutgers, and this is one of the things I point out to people. They were studying HIV, okay? And what they did was have mosquitoes bite HIV-infected people and then see if, I mean, obviously it has the virus now, and it could not transmit that to another creature. So it's this vector competency thing that I keep coming back to, but I do get a lot of pushback from people that Larry, I got Lyme from a mosquito, or I got Lyme from a bed bug, I got Lyme from, a flea bite, and that's just not borne out. It just scientifically doesn't add up.
Is there any, can you think of any evolutionary reason why ticks have evolved into what my friend Carlene calls roving septic tanks? I mean, what's in it for them to carry these bugs?
Nothing. If you think about it in an anthropomorphic point of view, the tick is actually a victim, okay? The bacteria is using the tick for its own purposes. So the tick's kind of in the middle and we're collateral damage.
Interesting. Okay. All right, I don't know if that'll satisfy my friends, but it is what it is. This is what the science suggests. So
it is.
Fair enough. So, going back to cats and dogs, so any comments, subjective or scientific, about allowing your pets to sleep with you? It seems like a high-risk proposition, right?
This came up at a meeting yesterday. I serve on a task force, and there was a veterinarian there, and he was referencing that, the risk that people have in having, their dogs in bed with them. And I thought about that since yesterday. And a tick that's attached to a dog and feeding, there's no reason for it to go through all the kind of physical expense of detaching, which is a process. It's got to secrete different enzymes, back itself out. And is it responding to, the fact that there's a person next to the dog? That doesn't seem to make sense. Ticks, once they're attached, they go through their feeding cycles until they're fully engorged. I think that the risk is really if there are unattached ticks on the animal, and the ticks are walking along, and your arm or leg happens to be in contact with the dog, and that tick just might, just kind of keep walking until it's on you. Do ticks prefer people versus dogs? Don't know. It's an interesting question that people pose to me, that they're out with a friend and one of them gets all the ticks and the other doesn't. Are they a tick magnet? And there is some evidence to suggest that ticks do make decisions about who they bite. It's well known in mosquitoes that if you're in an outdoor activity like a barbecue and it's dusk, mosquitoes will actually pick out individual people based on how they smell. So ticks seem to have that same sort of capacity.
So what do ticks like to smell?
I don't know.
What do mosquitoes like to smell?
Well, take that back. Ticks actually have very good noses, okay? Very, very sensitive. They can detect, carbon dioxide, for example, is a stimulant that tells me that something alive is nearby, and they can orient to those stimuli.
Interesting. Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap it up soon, but I think it's important just to talk about one interesting development that we talked about before we started the interview. What's going on with the CDC and the IDSA and perhaps insurance companies?
Sure. I noted in the news recently that the CDC Centers for Disease Control had cut its ties with the Infectious Disease Society of America. Now that's the group that develops the diagnosis and treatment guidelines, which a lot of people consider to be too conservative, because there's another organization over here that says your recommendation of 28 days of antibiotics and you're cured. They respectfully disagree. They actually are very adversarial. And so I didn't know why the CDC had cut their ties until a few days later, when I learned that the AG in Texas filed a lawsuit against the IDSA, and co-defendants include Blue Cross Blue Shield. There seems to be indications that this group was taking money from insurance companies. And so now you kind of look at that, they can hardly be considered to be a third party, impartial developer of guidelines. So I don't know where this is going to go, but it's going to be very interesting.
Well, certainly we all hope it leads to better diagnostic criteria, better diagnostics, and hopefully better treatment. So that may be good news. We'll keep our fingers crossed.
Absolutely.